recording now. Okay, and I'm going to, before I hand over to Julia and wish everyone, I just want to say a very warm welcome to everyone this afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our very, very first PPEA event and our first In Conversation with event. And the wonderful Julia Lawrence is going to be kicking us off with these events. We have several planned, which I will be sharing with you towards the end of the session. If you would like to, if you enjoyed today and you'd like to join us for a few more of these events as and when you are free to over the coming months. There's loads of you joining us this afternoon, which is great, up to 60 people already. So we're looking forward to a really lively debate and discussion. A few words just to begin about the format of the session. In a minute, I'll be introducing Julia, and Julia and I will be having a conversation about debates in primary physical education. And this is linked to a recent piece of writing Julia has, but not limited to, I believe, Julia, but linked to a piece of writing Julia has just completed on a chapter in debates in primary education. A really good read, so I do recommend the book if you're interested in all things primary, a really interesting and recent publication. Before we do that, after we've had a conversation, we're going to open up the floor and see if anyone wants to ask Julia any questions about things that have come up or questions they have around topical debates that are currently around the subject of primary PE. We are obviously today hosting you as our first event of Primary PE Assembly. We would really encourage you to take a look at the website if you haven't done already. I would like to share towards the end of the session before we go today a few opportunities of how you can get involved in the PPEA, particularly related to our community pages, but we'd also just love to hear from you if you have any ideas for events or things we can do to facilitate and bring the profession together. Always, this assembly is absolutely for everybody, and we really want to encourage ideas to come from colleagues across the sector. Okay, so Julia, I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest this afternoon, if I may. Julia is, I believe, currently a lecturer in education at Northumbria. Is that right, Julia?
Yes, yes, I'm now up in Northumbria.
And you've been previously worked at Brunel and Leeds Met University and been involved across both primary and secondary provision there in those institutions, but started her career teaching in secondary schools. And when the Youth Sport Trust programmes got involved, you were heavily involved in the delivery of YST programmes in primary. But your PhD focused on primary and secondary transition. Yeah. So we can start to see how your love for both PE across those two sectors has been pulled together. Rather interestingly, you might not know, if you know Julie, you might not know that she's been also working abroad, working internationally with teachers in Ireland, Cyprus, Germany, South Africa and Singapore. She is currently a visiting fellow with the Physical Education and Sports Teachers Academy of Singapore, which is part of the Ministry of Education, where she is supporting and mentoring development and undertaking a review of professional development delivered by that academy. Is that just in primary physical education, Julia?
No, they deliver across primary and secondary. Very fascinating place to go and visit and learn a lot from. And I think it's a sharing of ideas.
Absolutely. So that sounds fascinating. So I'm assuming some of the ideas you've built up around the debates discussion have come from engagement across all those different interests in other educational communities beyond our own here in England as well. Yeah, wonderful. So we'll look forward to hear a little bit more about that. Your writing recently, though, has been focused on physical education and mentoring, and I believe you and Christy, who joins us on the call, and Christy's one of our next speakers next month in this event around mentoring in primary PE. So that's in that edited book on mentoring in primary teaching for Full stop. So yeah. Wonderful. Do check that out. And Christy, we won't steal your thunder for that. We know that's something you're going to be talking a lot more about. So we're really privileged to have Julia here today. She, as you can see, has got a long, extensive career in physical education and brings lots of different insights into the topic around debates. So I'm going to start by asking you, Julia, if I may, what you think the key debates are in our time for primary PE. What are some of the big kind of headlines that you think are grabbing the big headlines topic?
I think when we start looking at physical education in general, and then narrowing it down into primary physical education, to me it's about, well, what do we see physical education as? What do we value about physical education? Because seeing all the people on here, it's great to see people from, we've got initial teacher students in, we've got academics, we've got people, Ramon's here from Malta, we've got people from across the country, the world, different levels of experience. And I think it's about, here we've probably got a really positive group of people who, value what physical education has to offer. But as you say, we've probably might have got up to about 100 people who are having this conversation, but there's thousands of teachers in primary school who didn't necessarily have the greatest experience of physical education. They don't understand, or they don't fully appreciate the value it has. And I think, it's how one of the core, the central core debates for me is, well, what is the value of physical education? Why should it have a place in a curriculum, or should it have a place in a curriculum? Should it be as almost a standalone and it's part of an everyday process in schools? But I think it's about how we then disseminate that value and how we share that passion that to other people, and that goes into how do we train teachers, how do we support them through their what will be their early career teachers period? How do we then sort of almost provide a pathway through to develop it and understand? So I think that's what's one of the first ones. I think the second one is around, well, who is teaching physical education? So if we really value it as it, we want people to be able to deliver it at a high quality. But who is best placed to deliver that? Do we want to go down a route where we say, well, everyone in a primary school has to deliver physical education? We've sort of been there, we've moved away from that. Do we want to outsource and buy people in to come and deliver it? And the implications of that, and where does that sit us in terms of, well, what is physical education? And then I think the third one is, well, how do we train them? How do we, that CPD element? So I think to me, there's probably two really big ones. What is physical education? What does it stand for? What does it allow us to achieve? And then linked to that as well, who's best placed to teach it?
So the one kind of leads to the other then, I suppose, or do you see them being connected? Or, once we define what its purpose is and how it should be, does then help us answer the question of who then is best placed to deliver? Does one help solve the other and feed into the other, or are they separate, isolated issues?
No, I think you're right. I think we can look at them as a, it's not quite let's throw it all into a big melting pot, give it a big let it bubble and see what spills over the side. It's it's not quite the chicken and egg scenario either, but it's about, well, if we can clearly define what we think the purpose of physical education is, and we can come up with some structure that says, well, this is what we would want it to look like, then we can start saying, well, okay, if that's what we want it to look like, how are we best to manage that? How are we best organizing that? I've worked extensively in primary schools and secondary schools, and I've gone down the route of, I trained as a secondary and then have worked in primary, and you have that debate about, well, should someone in a secondary be working in a primary school setting? Where's the knowledge, skills and understanding? But I think it's also about, well, how do we as practitioners develop? And where do we go and get that information from? How do we support our own professional development so that we start to look and I've had the privilege of working across a range of organisations, internationally, locally, across the country. But what I always think to myself is, okay, let me go and have a look at something, and what can I take away from that context and use in a different context? Because ultimately, the central core thing in physical education and how we teach physical education is those pupils.
Yeah.
And so what experience are those pupils having to support them to become physically educated? And linked into that, well, who's best there supporting them?
Yeah. So you've touched on this already. This might be a bit of a nasty question to ask, Julia, but how is PE defined? I mean, I suppose this might come from your own personal view, but it also might come from a view that is more a sort of groupthink, topic, popular view of PE at the moment. How do you think primary PE is being defined currently? Is that in line with your own views?
If you were to say to me, and I think if you asked the question to anyone on here, we'd probably have similar buzzwords that popped out. We wouldn't necessarily agree on a definitive definition, because I think what happens is how we define something is based on our own experiences. So we bring ourselves into the conversation. But for me, physical education is using the physical domain or the physical context to educate pupils to understand things such as how to be physically active, how, what happens to their bodies as they are physically active. How can they then use that learning to take ownership of their own learning moving forward? It's about developing knowledge, skills, and understanding of fundamental movement skills, which will allow them to apply those into different contexts. But equally, when I look at physical education and I observe pupils being physically educated and engaging in it, it's also about, well, how do we create that level of motivation that wants them to come back? How do we implant that value with them? Because when I go back to my PhD, which I completed in 2006, and it was actually looking at the impact of transition from primary to secondary school around the affective domain. So how they felt about them in terms of self-esteem, motivation. Because what we know is if we can motivate pupils to be physically active and engage, and this brings in Margaret Whitehead's work around physical literacy, if we can motivate them and they see the value in doing something, they're likely to persist in it. Whereas if we don't create that engaging environment where pupils want to come to physical education, then we're almost putting them off to start off with. And I think that's some of the research that's starting to come out as well, is that it's what happens in primary school as much as what happens in secondary school that has this impact on pupils being physically active. So how would I define it? I would probably use keywords like motivation, about value, about being physical, understanding how they can be physical but also work in the physical. It's about socialization, understanding how to work with each others. It's about gaining confidence and competence. So a lot of my thinking does revert back to what Margaret White has around physical literacy. But again, other people will say, well, I totally disagree with that. But I think in a primary school setting, it's about providing those fundamentals, providing those building blocks that the pupils can then access to continue to participate.
So coming back to a few points you've made earlier, then there's a lot of things you've said there that I'm sure globally we would have some affinity to. The basis of movement, fundamental movement, the ability to work in and through and about movement, all these wonderful concepts that we share as a global community about physical education. In England specifically, if I can bring your attention, it's been a huge political arena, and it has been since the London 2012 Games, and arguably even earlier. And we hear the government rhetoric a lot in documents, talking about a world-class physical education. We want a world-class physical education here in England. How do we how do we, what's preventing us? Why are we not there yet? I mean, we've had billions of pounds invested in the last 2 decades. What's stopping us from being a world-class physical education, or are we world-class at the moment? What's preventing us there? Sorry, these are really nasty.
I think if you want to be world-class, you've got to look at everything. And it's not just about saying, well, what we'll do is we'll give you some money, and you can use that money in such a way that you can go and buy in coaches and teachers and people to come and do it. I think if you are fundamentally committed to something world class, you invest in it in such a way that it will become world class. The limiting factor I would say, from every primary school is, do they actually have the facilities to be able to provide for world-class physical education? I was amazed when I went to Singapore, absolutely amazed. You go in, okay, they've got lots, they're a very affluent country, they are very conformist, but you go into their primary schools, yes, they have 2,000 students in a primary school, but they will have an 8 badminton court sports hall. Plus, they will have an outdoor space. Plus, they will have a covered outdoor space, because after about 10:30 in the summer, they're not allowed to go out because it's too hot. And then they'll have a huge hall, which they have their assemblies in, but you can still use. And I think that for a lot of the time, it's a limiting factor. If you have a very small space, are you able to, yes, you can be creative, but actually, what does that say about the value you are giving that subject? When first place to go is the hall. Oh, it's lunchtime, so you can't go in and do PE in the hall. You can't do physical education in the hall because we've got to set up. Or you can't do physical education in the hall after lunchtime because we've got to put everything down. And then it's like break times. Can you actually access the facilities outside? And I think that for me, that's one of the fundamentals. If you can think about how you create the facilities. I also think, and this is, I sometimes wonder if I've been in education too long, because I become quite cynical. It's like, surely, if you've got all this money, it might be better spent if you group it together. So rather than saying, right, let's give £9,000 to every school, why don't we say, right, let's get together as a group and we've got this pot of money, how can we best use that money? And it may well be that then you can, it's all about market forces. Can we get a better deal on something? Can we actually, as a group, employ someone? And I'm sure there are some really switched on organisations that have done this, multi-academy trusts or those sort of things, who said, well, let's get someone in and support everyone about it. And until you get, I think, until you get some form of consistency about what's going on, then that's where you get the reduction in quality assurance.
Well, there's 2 things there that's really interesting. I suppose one of the things you're talking about there is infrastructure, and not only infrastructure in terms of buildings and facilities, but maybe that subtler infrastructure about how we manage things and process things, and how physical education is managed as an educational venture and activity. And then the other thing you've mentioned, which we see a lot of writing that critiques a sort of neoliberal market agenda for physical education, but are you suggesting there that actually that could be quite a good thing, that if we bring money together and we create a more competitive market for more effectiveness of that money? Because is it fair to say schools currently, when you are investing in, if money is a factor for physical education, if it's too much, we don't know how to spend it. But if it's not enough, it's not enough to invest. So we need to group together and marketize better.
I think what from my perspective, when I've spoken to people, there is an element of, well, we can just buy someone in to deliver it. And when you look at the context of what it was set up for and the legacy, and you're absolutely right. If you can go back to the turn of the century and look at what was in place then with sports colleges and things like that, it's a cyclical thing. Everything, we just seem to be throwing things at physical education, and well, it didn't really work, so we'll try something else. And there are some things that have kept going, but I think it's what is out there to support that teacher in that school who wants to do something around physical education but isn't quite sure. You know, I've got this funding. How can I act? What can I use it for? You know, how am I reporting it? And I think it comes back to the levels of accountability. And you know, a lot of times in education, a lot of funding goes in, but the level of accountability just doesn't always feel as though it's there. You know, how are you using that money? But it's not about, well, yeah, well, we've sent these people on courses or we've brought these people in. Okay, that's great. But what impact has it had? What impact has it had on the quality of the physical education that is being taught in your school? What impact has it had on those members of staff who are teaching physical education? And time again, and working with students in initial teacher education, it's, well, we don't do physical education because someone else comes in. Well, can you go and watch them? Because that's what you're supposed to be doing.
So whose responsibility is the accountability, or where should the accountability lie? Should it be at the governmental level? I mean, and apologies to colleagues outside of our English context here, with policy discussions at the moment, very much about that between yourself and I, Julia. But where does, I guess this is a broader question about where accountability lies in physical education anyway. Is it with the government organisations? Is it for them to be checking back in, the inspectorate body of education? Is it for the head teachers, or is it for the individual teacher, or is it all of the above? I mean, if you're outsourcing your PE, where does the accountability lie in terms of the monitoring and the tracking? Is it fair to put that on an outsourced provider's sort of shoulders? Where does the buck stop, as it were, and how do we resolve the accountability question?
I think one of the issues in terms of accountability, you'd like to say whoever's funding has some form of accountability structure in place there that people report to. Okay, but I think most of us would probably honestly admit that if we were to look at all the accountability measures, they're not always followed, and then, you know, people aren't always checking in. You know, so when was the last time a primary school got asked to identify how they'd spent their pupil premium funding? You know, a questionnaire comes out that requires people to respond, and you know, about you know, how levels of activity and things. You know, how are we responding to that? And I think because we've not been clear about, or we don't appear to be clear about what physical education is, we have this group of organisations all claiming aspects of physical education. So if you were to go and do a straw poll, and I'm sure it's the same internationally, okay, where's most of the funding coming from in physical education? Well, one of the first ones is you've got the Youth Sport Trust, okay, and if you look at Youth Sport Trust, you know, they've put an awful lot into creating resources to support schools. That's where the TOPS programs came from, and you know, I still use a lot of the resources that they created because they work for me. But alongside there, you've got Sport England. Now, Sport England is the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. You know, they're putting funding into promoting as well. Then you've got AFPE, Association for Physical Education, and other countries will have their own organisations. You know, where do AFPE sit within it all? And then, you know, in the book chapter, I talk about, have we created a void because we're not sure of what we're all doing or what's going on out there, and we still fundamentally want to have high quality physical education. We've almost got a void where people can start coming into, and it's about, again, it comes down to market forces. If there's a void, people will create something that goes into it. Now, some of it is outstanding, some of it's absolutely fantastic, but you do question, you know, is that really the best use? And because there's this pot of money, what you start to see is other people going, oh, well, actually, we can tap into that. Yeah, well, you can use your premium to run a course around active maths or active English. Okay, that's great, but how is that supporting the promotion of physical education in your school? So I think where accountability comes a little bit unstuck is, I'm not sure everyone knows who they're accountable to. And that again comes back down to the organisation. and management of, well, let's all get together and say, what is it we want to achieve? We've got this pot of money. Whether this pot of money remains, we're not sure, but we've got this. How can we work together to create the best experiences for those pupils? And always coming back to the pupils. What do those pupils need? What will support them to develop passion for physical education? And first thing this morning, we get another edict is coming out about how there's a new health body being created to look at obesity and physical activity. And you sort of know that those of us who are wise know that the best place to go and get funding to promote something is you're either going to do it on a health agenda or you're going to do it on a sport agenda. But does physical education sit within those, or is it, is it used as a vehicle to promote that? Do we have sufficient curriculum time to be able to do it?
So I suppose, you wrote this chapter, and I suppose these discussions were happening all pre-COVID, and traditionally we know, and we've heard, numerous times that the idea of sport as a PE as sport or physical education as healthism ideas. Are we now seeing that there's a new potential on the horizon as well, that there could be physical education to address mental health? It is, going back to your earlier point right at the start, where you talked about what are the current debates in your mind, it's still defining purpose of physical education and primary PE. Do you think there's still an issue then for physical education where we're trying to be all things to all people, or a subject that can be, I suppose, used to address some of these issues? Globally, these are issues. We have unique issues in England and the UK because of the funding policy. And I noticed Ramon's comment on there that their country has very little funding in Malta, for example, and other countries will feel empathy with that. We've got a lot of money. So are these political agendas starting to define what physical education is because we need to keep the money, or is money now becoming a problem? Is it becoming the barrier to progress? Is the money distracting from the purpose?
It comes down to who becomes the master. So who is controlling? I think it's who's controlling what the physical education agenda is. And I look at my experiences, when I trained years ago, when I trained to be a physical education teacher, the amount of time I had to develop my subject knowledge was, you were doing about 30, 40 hours a week. If we don't invest in the training of the teachers and thinking about, okay, if they're going to deliver this high quality physical education, how are we supporting those? If we're not looking, and this is where Singapore do really well, this Academy of Singapore Teachers is part of the Ministry of Education, and it is the CPD, professional development arm for physical education. And they have programs for early beginning teachers, subject leaders. There's a pathway that they can follow. They have their allocated time each year to do it. But I think, going back to the question, I think if we're not careful, we evolve physical education to be what people think it should be, or that will give us, status at that time, rather than saying, actually, physical education is about working with, providing pupils with a knowledge, skill, and understanding about how to, as you said, work in, through, beyond the physical. I think it's also really, because we have a very sporting agenda, and we've got the health agenda, and physical education is the time that we introduce pupils to different sports in some contexts. I think we have to be very careful that we don't become so politicized we just follow where the funding streams are, because ultimately we're providing part of their overall education. And I don't see us having conversations in math, science, and English like this. Okay, yes, we might have models of how to deliver mathematics, and we might have phonics, and people say, well, hold on, Ruth Miskins gets millions of pounds to support phonics, and if you want to go and get Tom Bennett does all around behavior and such like. But we constantly, and maybe it's because it's our subject, we keep on coming back, and it's almost, who owns physical education? How can we as physical educationalists grab back physical education to what the core qualities and the requirements and the skills that you can develop through it?
So I suppose that leads me, I guess, to my final question, Julia, before we open up to colleagues. I see the chat function's been lively while we've been speaking.
Switched it off.
Which is wonderful. So I'm really hoping we'll bring some colleagues in to add to this discussion. But I suppose to bring it to a conclusion, what's the way forward now? How do we move forward as a subject? And I guess there's a question there for us within our own locations, wherever we are educating in physical education across the world. We have that question around our local way forward. But then there's also the bigger way forward conceptually about physical education that you've raised. So bearing in mind the context that yourself is located in, perhaps you can answer based on our location to start with, and then maybe if there's a thought to a more conceptual understanding, that would be, if that's.
I think the one thing I've got out of COVID is that people are not that far away. So, we're here. We made contact probably 6 months ago. I picked up that, I thought I need to have a conversation with this person. That's how we've evolved. So within 6 months, we've evolved into something that I think is a powerful, it's a little seedling. We're growing and we're nurturing it. And I think what you've got, because we've got 100 odd people joining us today, is you've got a group of people that aren't just UK based, but are international based. And I think what we need to do is start talking to each other. We were joking before we started, leave the egos at the door. If you want to have a conversation about physical education, then let's have this conversation about what physical education is. How do we want to develop it, and how do we want to support it? Otherwise, other people will be having those conversations, and we lose an element of control over it.
And sorry to interrupt, and maybe that conversation isn't something that has a finite end. It's not we're not trying to reach a conclusion. Is it the process of the conversation?
It's the process of the conversation that I think we need to have. We need to be, we need to go as a group, pulling anyone who wants to have that conversation. Don't think it's an exclusive group. It's the more people who wants to join in and have this conversation, the more powerful it becomes, because ultimately we need to be advocates of our subject. We need to be working with people who are delivering physical education to support them to grow, develop, to get them to feed into us as well about their experiences. In terms of the concept of it, I think if we maintain what for me, physical education is about the physical. Okay, it is, and I go back to when we were talking about the definition. It's about developing that knowledge, skill, and understanding that you can then use to make choices about how you move forward with it. So it comes back to the relevance of the curriculum. It comes back to opportunities. It comes back to those facilities. Are we creating a subject that allows pupils to become passionate about it? And who are the best people to support us with that? And it may be that you've got someone who is equally passionate from a sporting background, and we have that conversation and say, right, okay, well, let's work together. Let's not see us as, you're this organization, and we're competing. We're not, because we shouldn't be competing around the education of children and young people.
Yes, we're directing our energies in the wrong place then, and we end up missing the purpose of the thing we're debating and talking about, don't we? And
we absolutely do, because you've always got to go back to the pupils in the classroom. What do I need to provide for those? How, if I want to produce and deliver and support high quality physical education, what do I need as an individual? I've got to take responsibility and be accountable for myself, because I'm accountable for what's happening in my classroom. But equally, those who are around me need to take some responsibility and offer support and guidance and structure that way.
That is a wonderful, I think, point to stop on. So shall we start that seedling and discussion now? We've got some time to bring some colleagues in to carry on the discussion there. Christy, are you there? May I bring you in? And have you had a little scan on maybe some of the chat comments, or would anybody like to come off mic, and I'll have a look off mic to see if anyone would like to have a conversation. But Christy, is there a question there that you've seen on the chat that we can?
I think we've got two really great questions to get us going, Julia, that come from both Jamie and Katriana. So Jamie asks in particular, who are our allies, and has talked in the chat in particular about the need to have our allies with us, but actually particularly asks, who are they? And Katrina has a very similar question, hence grouping together, of how do we get everybody on board? So if we're going to have this PE as a subject and PE as a movement, as Alison referred to it, how do we get everybody on board? So who are our buddies, and how do we get them on board?
Oh, do we actually know who our allies are? I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's who. If we start saying, well, we think this person's our ally and this person's our ally, do they come with it? What do they bring to the table? I would like to think that in general, if everyone's clear about their role in it, then we can work with the governing bodies, we can work with the sporting organisations, we can work with charitable organisations. But I think what has to happen, for people to be allies, they have to have a shared vision. And I think that's the important one, is what is the shared vision of what physical education will look like, because we don't have to always keep going back. We don't keep on having to go back to what in England was the 1933 syllabus, where we were in rows and we did Swedish gymnastics and it was healthy body, healthy mind, because even then they talked about the emotional benefits of physical education and the cognitive learning benefits of physical education. We don't have, if COVID's taught us nothing, it's, the one thing it has taught us is that we can communicate, and actually our allies aren't necessarily just in the UK. They're not just in Europe. They could be internationally. It could be just, our allies could be those people who are promoting physical education in their own environment. Be that a teacher in a primary school who is so passionate, and is supporting other teachers to develop their passion for physical education. Because I've picked up, passion is Michelle writes, passion is transferred from teacher to pupil, and I think that's what we've got to look in our allies, is the people who have a passion to provide high quality physical educations for our pupils. How do we get people on board? I think what we have to do is we have to be open and honest. We have to say it's not right. What's happening at the moment? There is some good bits. Let's try and pull out what people think the good bits are. Let's try and move forward. And I like Alison's PE as a movement. It is a movement, quite literally. It's physical, but actually, how do we then move our professional identity and our professionalism and our subject forward, bringing in people from different organisations, different communities. I've in the last 6 months, I've probably worked with more people from different organisations, be them academic, be them school, be they beginning teachers, be them experienced teachers, just by doing things like we've done today. And I think that's a really powerful thing, is that people coming together to have conversations with each other, so that people don't feel that they are on their own, and there's a group of people who are all supporting each other.
There was a question posted in the chat that I put up there, Saw, is that who's in charge then of PE? Who's responsible for bringing these conversations and these allies and these things together?
We go to our education minister. Physical education is part of the national curriculum. Therefore, physical education is under the auspices of the Department for Education. So ultimately, the buck stops with the Minister for Education. I think, but within a school context, physical education is responsibility of the teachers teaching physical education. I picked up there's, do we need specialists or generalists? You need people with a passion for the subject. That was one thing I always, and I still do when I'm working with beginning teachers, is trying to get their mindset that they are capable of teaching physical education. And I think, you've either had a really good experience or a really bad experience. Sometimes you have one in the middle, but it's about coming back and understanding that your experiences and how you as an individual value physical education has an impact on how you will then address it and deliver it. So you within the UK context, we've got the Association for Physical Education, which is our subject association. And I think, there's a responsibility within a subject association to promote and develop the subject itself. And we can all have conversations about whether we think it's doing a good job or a not so good job. I think what muddies the water with physical education is you've got your subject association, but then you've got organisations like Sport England and Youth Sport Trust who are also putting things into schools. So you do get that incredibly muddying. And I've been experiencing it on a project I'm working with a teaching school. Is I'm going in and I'm working on a project which is funded by an organisation, but then to access some of the training, I go to a different organisation, and you almost have, and Christy's smiling now, you almost have this pot of money that just seems to go round in the washing machine. And every now and again it flings out and you go and get something else and you put it back into the wash and it goes round. So I'm not sure where this money actually ends up going.
Do you think part of the problem is we haven't got an agreed definition of what is included in PE? It seems to be building every year, seems to be and PE and physical activity and school sport and movement and well-being and health. And Ange has picked up one of her questions in the chat has been, do you think that this is where the value of PE it then becomes difficult, in the fact that maybe we're not valuing primary PE because we haven't necessarily got a clear definition as to what we are all talking about, and that the teachers are a broken part of PE itself? And actually, do we need to fix PE and our definitions of what PE is first before we then can actually make much more of an impact in schools?
And Christy, if I can just add to that, Dominic Tullen, I believe, Dominic, you're from Scotland there. You've added an extra point in there, that is there too much emphasis now on sport and physical activity, in that point you made there, Christy, that's kind of extended and conflated our understanding and lost what physical education is. Can I throw Dominic's point in there as well?
Yeah, I think it does come back to what we fundamentally believe physical education to be, and I think in a quest to give it's not credit, but so I think in a quest to almost give value to the subject, we almost fall into a trap of saying, well, we can do this with it, rather than saying, actually, what we have, we don't need to create something new. Actually, we know one of the big issues with students going back and pupils going back in school is about health and well-being. But we know that if all the literature is there, if you are if you understand about physical education, you are engaged in physical activity, you know that there are benefits of it. And I was speaking with Professor Joe Harris a few months ago, and it's we know we don't necessarily push the benefits enough about being physically active. We know what happens to us when we get physically active. You ask a pupil what happens when you're running around, and they can tell you what happens. The body changes, but I don't think we really push the benefits of it. About the skills you're learning now will allow you to make the choices later on in life. And I always ask students, when was the last time you went on a cross-country run? When was the last time you did a 1500 meters? It comes back to the relevance of what are we teaching pupils and how are we making it relevant to their experiences. So Jules, I'm pretty sure I picked up that she was doing a cross-country on scooters. because that's, you know, that's how they get around now, you know, and that's just the adults. You know, I think Angie's right. It's about, we need to get a clear definition of what we see physical education to be, or the key context of what physical education is, and then from that we can build.
Jamie's made a point here, which has caught my eye, that says perhaps important now to shift away from being a specialist traditionalist, away from content specialists, perhaps to curricular specialists or pedagogical specialists. Maybe that's an interesting shift, you know, drawing on some of that models-based pedagogy we know in PE. And he's put, again, governing bodies are good, but they do, you know, produce that kind of behaviourist teaching styles, discipline, mastery, content, knowledge agenda. So is that something you see that could be?
Yeah, I think how we deliver physical education is an important, it's very important. I think if we do go down a very direct, and I'm of an era where I revert back to Moss and Ashworth, because I think if you look at any of the models-based practice, and there will be people who shoot me down for this, if you look at any of the models-based practice, you can go back and say that actually they fundamentally are rooted in Moss to Ashworth spectrum, and you can go and look at other work that looks about productive and reproductive pedagogies. The bottom line is, how do we deliver our subject in such a way that it engages the pupils that we are working with? How do we deliver it in such a way that they feel valued in that subject and they are able to succeed in that subject? And because if they are getting success, and the other thing I talk to my trainee primary students about is the skills you need to teach physical education are the skills you need to teach. The difference is that it comes back to the content. The content's different. So, you know, how you teach a maths lesson and how you teach a phonics lesson or a science lesson, there are similar skills that you can take from there and use when you're teaching physical education. And I think there is this fear that physical education, because they're not, you know, sat behind a desk, they're not controlled, you've got them moving around, that it's like I've got to do something completely different, and it's not.
So do you think it's been damaging then to make us seem that we're different to the rest of the curriculum, rather than, have we endangered ourselves by making us specialists rather than looking at how we're similar to other curricular areas? Has that been a barrier, do you see, in some of the things you've been talking about today?
I don't think it's necessarily worked against us. I think that because of the nature of physical education, and, you know, at times a reluctance to teach it, it's a very easy subject to push to a side, unless, you know, the SATs are out of the way, and then year 6 do lots of physical activity and go on residentials and things like that. But I think it comes down to how the subject itself is valued within a primary curriculum. You know, because you don't have this conversation about mathematics. The first thing that happened on the 8th of March here in the UK, or in England, was when the schools went back, well, it's all about catch up. It's, you know, we've got to catch them up on maths, science and English. Actually, no, what you need to do is how do you know they've fallen behind what? And you've just made an assumption there. But actually, you know, one of the things they need to catch up is talking to each other and, you know, communicating with each other and actually seeing each other. You know, we're actually on Easter holidays here, and the number of groups of 6, I hasten to add, of school children who are now wandering around together because it's the first time they've been able to go out and do some form of physical activity in a group of 6. And, you know, number of children with footballs, rugby balls, and, you know, they'll be running on the side. You know, there will be little people swimming in the sea, I can assure you, even though it's quite chilly. But for me, it's about the value, and it will always come back to the value of our subject within the context of the curriculum.
Christy, I think we've got time for just another question before we start to wrap up. Is that okay? And there's hundreds on there. I'm just trying to scan through the chat as well, but I think you've got one there for us to finish up.
So we've got a combo question from Jamie and Greg for you. So Greg is asking in particular, do we need to be clearer to tell others what PE is, and if so, what is it? And Jamie asked in particular, how do we help to subtract the noise so we don't get lost down, for example, a well-being route?
Yeah, squeaky door. Squeaky door always gets fixed, doesn't it? That's the, you know, that's what everyone keeps on. And there's a lot of there is a lot of noise. And I think that's one thing we have to, I noticed that over the weekend. There was a lot of noise. And you know, everyone, I fundamentally believe everyone in physical education and on the periphery of physical education does see its value, and basically are trying to promote it the best way they can. I think sometimes that goes into conflict, and it's how do we quieten the noise, and actually how do we get the message across? I don't have the answers. I'm going to be perfectly honest, don't have the answers, but I think one answer is to have conversations like this, where people are saying, actually, yeah, I'm not the only person who's thinking this. And then it's about, well, how do we, you know, work with, for example, Primary Physical Education Assembly, about getting that message out. It's about getting the message out about what physical education is, what its value is. Yes, we are going to, I think we will be pushed down a health and well-being agenda. My fear is that will become the core crux of what physical education becomes. But I also feel that there's enough people in positions who will say, no, that's not. It's part of it because we know it affects its social, affective, emotional, all those aspects. But I think it is. What are our next steps? Because that will be the next question. Where do we go from here? Is we carry on the conversations. We bring like-minded people together who become our allies. We grow as a body. We get that movement going with the passion that we have. And wherever we can, we try and get that message out, be it through an academic journal, be it through a conference, you know, be it going and working in schools and saying, let's have a look at what's going on and how can we support you to grow further. I know Christy Canterbury is looking at how, you know, they can support beginning teachers, early career teachers, etc. down there. I think what we've got to be wary of is all that political noise. And that political noise isn't going to go away because of the health aspects of it and the sporting aspects of it. But what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that where the void comes, we're pushing up through it and saying, hold on a minute, is that really what you want physical education to be? You know, is it about just getting sports coaches in, you know, or is it about supporting the teachers who are there to give them confidence? Because also, what message does it say if we say, well, hold on a minute, we're going to put these sports coaches in from these governing bodies because they can do a better job than the teachers? Well, why would a teacher then want to teach it? You know, there's so many tangled. We need, it's a forest at the moment and it's all tangled up, and someone needs to go through and just cut the weeds back and see what comes back from it.
I think possibly, Julia, just to finish off that point there, that conversation then breeds understanding, doesn't it? And perhaps rather than competing against what it should be and what different camps believe it should be, by talking to each other, we build a better understanding of where the other person's perspective is. So maybe that's where that detangling of the web can start, and we can see our way through a bit better.
Yeah.
Julia, I thank you so much for kicking off our series of discussions today with, I think debates in primary PE probably underpins everything now that will follow, because whatever we have a conversation about with colleagues over the next few months, I'm sure it's going to come back to these points you've made about understanding, communication, thinking about concepts of PE, what we're about, how we define it, who's accountable. It seems impossible that any particular topic cannot relate back to some of the things you've presented with us with such insight and foresight today. So a huge thank you from everyone here, but particularly from myself, Jez and Christy, to start our PPEA events going. And before we do go, folks, if I may just share a few thoughts before we go, just so I'm sure many of you have come to have a look at the website, and that's our wonderful first event today. We have, I think Julia has mentioned today lots about coming together, speaking as a community, and that's really what we want to do at the PPEA. Is we're not a sort of hierarchical organisation. We're not going to establish things unless the community has brought them to us. So like this idea was brought to us today, we said let's have a go. We want to be a facilitator and a host and a voice for lots of stakeholders who have an interest in primary physical education. And I saw lots and lots of points in the chat about advocacy, about speaking out, about showing the voice and getting the voices out there. So what we believe and want physical education to be about in primary is really heard about. So please do use us as a platform. If you've got some ideas in which to do that, we'd love to hear from you. In particular, we'd love you to get involved through our community page. If you visit the website and click on community page, we would love to receive contributions from the sector out there to share what's going on in the primary physical education community. And that could be a piece of work you're doing, a case study, it could be a network that you're involved in that you would like to tell everybody about, a blog or opinion piece, maybe a spotlight on a day in the life of your work as a physical educator or a person involved in the primary physical education sector. If so, please email me at vrandall@ppea.org.uk and share with me what you would like to put on that community page, and we would love to share that with you. Just to note, we would say we're steering away from anything that is about selling services or products. So this is about an open and free collaboration to share insights and thoughts. So as Judy has done today, to get that conversation and knowledge and understanding going. And as you know, we're here to know, do and inspire. So if there is something new you would like to share or contribute or be involved in or like to see us do, we would equally love to hear from you. But do let us know on Twitter or via our email address as well. Julia, it would be wrong for me not to share the text that you have eloquently and brilliantly given us insight from today. Do go and have a read. It's a great text around primary education, but in particular, as a PE community, Julia's chapter on debates in primary PE, where you can see her thinking develop a little bit more there. So moving forward then, we have the wonderful Christy joining us, our very own, and Gerald over the next couple of months. Those website links are up there on the PPA website or Eventbrite or through our Twitter handle to register like you've done today, free to meet us with our next conversation. Christy is going to share with us some insights on mentoring in primary PE. And Gerald and I are going to share some thoughts on the second edition of the Introduction to Primary PE text, which we're currently putting together in publication for next year. So if you would like to come and get a sneaky insight into some of the topics, ideas and thoughts from that book, you'd be most welcome. And in June, we have Dr. Kirsten Petrie from New Zealand, who's going to share her wealth of insights around primary PE on lots of many different varied topics. So do sign up for those. We will have to start capping around 100. So we nearly got there today. So if you don't want to be disappointed and miss that 100 sign up, then please make sure you register on those dates. Dates and times and details are again on the website. So that just leads me to conclude and thank you once again, Julia, for all your time today and sharing with us some debates in primary PE. So I think a last shout out to everybody. Let's keep those conversations going. We'll put this recording up on the website on PPEA. If you'd like to come back and listen to it or share it with your colleagues or students at a later date, that would be wonderful. But do keep in touch and we'll see you next month, and see you next month, Christy. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe and wonderful evening. Julia, I'm just going to